Welcome back to Sleepy History Nights, where we travel through time with stories told gently, like whispers from the past. Tonight, we begin a new journey, the life of a man who saw the world differently from everyone else. A man who looked at a bird's wing and saw the mathematics of flight, who stared at water flowing over rocks and understood the hidden patterns of nature, who painted fewer than 20 paintings in his entire life, yet changed art forever. His name was Leonardo da Vinci. Before we begin, if you enjoy these quiet journeys through history, take a moment to subscribe to Sleepy History Nights, leave a like, and settle in. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let this story carry you through the life of one of history's most curious minds. It was April 15th, 1452, in the hills of Tuscany, Italy. In a small stone farmhouse near the town of Vinci, a baby was born just as the sun was setting at the third hour of the night, as the records would later say. The child's mother was a young peasant woman named Caterina. His father was Ser Piero da Vinci, a 25-year-old notary from a respectable family. They were not married. In the strict social world of 15th century Italy, this meant the baby was illegitimate, born outside of marriage, without the legal rights of a legitimate heir. His full name would be Leonardo di Ser Piero da Vinci, Leonardo, son of Ser Piero, from Vinci, but to the world, he would simply become Leonardo. Shortly after his birth, Ser Piero took custody of the child. Caterina, his mother, would marry another man and fade from Leonardo's life, leaving behind only questions and a hollow space where a mother's love should have been. Leonardo was raised primarily by his paternal grandfather, Antonio, and his uncle Francesco. In the family home in Vincia, small hilltop town surrounded by olive groves, vineyards, and rolling countryside, it was a childhood split between two worlds. He was part of a respectable family, yet not quite legitimate. He had comfort and safety, yet carried the quiet stigma of being born outside the rules. Perhaps this is why he would spend his life questioning rules, looking beyond boundaries, refusing to accept that things simply were, without understanding why. Vinci was not Florence. It was not a city of grand palaces and wealthy patrons. It was a town of farmers, craftsmen, and notaries, practical people who worked with their hands and trusted what they could see and touch. But for a boy like Leonardo, Vinci was perfect. The hills around the town were alive with movement and mystery. There were streams that twisted through the valleys, their water catching the light as it tumbled over smooth stones. There were forests where shadows shifted with the wind, and meadows where wildflowers bloomed in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. And there were birds, so many birds. Leonardo would sit for hours watching them. Not the way most children watch things, with passing interest and then distraction. No, Leonardo watched with an intensity that made adults uncomfortable. He studied how a bird's wings moved through the air, the angle, the rhythm, the way feathers adjusted with each shift of wind. He noticed how some birds soared without flapping, riding invisible currents of rising warm air. He saw how they tilted their wings to turn, how they tucked their legs when diving, how they spread their tail feathers too slow before landing. Most people looked at a bird and saw a bird. Leonardo looked and saw a machina, beautiful, perfect machine that somehow defied gravity. He would sketch them in the dirt with sticks, trying to capture the curve of a wing, the way feathers overlapped like roof tiles. His uncle Francesco noticed this obsession. Unlike Leonardo's father, who was often away in Florence managing legal affairs, Francesco spent time with the boy. He took him on long walks through the countryside, pointing out plants and animals, asking questions. encouraging Leonardo's endless curiosity. Why does water flow faster in the narrow parts of the stream? Leonardo would ask. Why do leaves spiral around a branch? Why does an echo sound different in a valley than near a wall? Francesco didn't always have answers, but he never dismissed their questions. And so Leonardo learned something crucial, that asking why was not only acceptable, it was necessary. As Leonardo grew older, his observations became more detailed. He would lie on his stomach at the edge of a stream, watching water flow around stones. He noticed how the water created swirls and eddies, how it moved faster on the surface than near the bottom, how it carved patterns into the sandy bed. He saw that water behaved almost like fabric, flowing, folding, creating shapes that repeated in different scales. When it rained, he would watch how droplets hit puddles, creating perfect circles that expanded outward. He wondered why circles, always circles. Why not squares or triangles? He studied shadows, how they changed length and angle as the sun moved across the sky, how they blurred at the edges rather than having sharp lines, how the shadow of a tree looked different depending on whether the light came from a clear sky or filtered through clouds, and he began to draw. At first, just simple sketches, a bird, a flower, a face. But even as a child, there was something different about Leonardo's drawings. They weren't just representations, they were investigations. He didn't draw what he thought a hand should look like. He drew what he observed a hand actually looked like, the way tendons moved under the skin, the subtle shadows in the creases of the palm, the slight variations in the length of each finger. His grandfather kept some of these early drawings, marveling at them, but not quite understanding what he was seeing. This wasn't the work of a normal child. This was the work of someone trying to decode reality itself. Leonardo had no formal education. Because he was illegitimate, he couldn't attend the prestigious schools that trained the sons of wealthy families. He learned to read and write later than most children, and he never mastered Latin, the language of scholars and the educated elite. In some ways, this was a disadvantage, but in other ways, it was a gift. He wasn't trained to think in the rigid categories of medieval education. He was even taught that some questions were inappropriate, or that certain truths were already settled by ancient authorities. Instead, he learned to trust what he could see, touch, and test. He learned from nature itself, the greatest teacher of all. Leonardo's father, Ser Piero, visited Vinci occasionally, checking on his illegitimate son, but maintaining a careful distance. Ser Piero had married legitimately this time and would go on to have many other children. Leonardo would always be separate from that family, the son from before, the one who didn't quite fit. But Ser Piero was not unkind. He provided for Leonardo, ensured he had food and shelter, and watched from a distance as the boy grew. And then, one day, when Leonardo was about 14, something changed. Ser Piero visited the family house in Vinci and noticed something different. Leonardo had been drawing sketches of animals, plants, human faces, landscapes. The drawings were scattered around the house, some on scraps of paper, some on old documents, some scratched into pieces of wood. Ser Piero picked up a few of them and studied them carefully. He was not an artist himself, but he knew quality when he saw it. These weren't the clumsy doodles of a child. These were sophisticated, observant, startlingly mature. He gathered several of the best drawings and took them with him back to Florence. Florence in the 1460s was the heart of the Renaissance society, exploding with art, commerce, and intellectual energy. The Medici family ruled as unofficial princes, using their banking wealth to patronize artists, architects, and scholars. The city was full of workshops where master craftsmen trained apprentices in painting, sculpture, metalwork, and architecture. These workshops were competitive, prestigious, and difficult to enter. Ser Piero knew the best of them. Through his legal work, he had connections throughout Florence, including with a master artist named Andrea del Verrocchio. Verrocchio was one of the most respected artists in Florence. His workshop was more than just a place to learn painting. It was a school of everythings: culture, metalwork, mathematics, engineering, anatomy. Ser Piero brought Leonardo's drawings to Verrocchio and asked his opinion. Verrocchio studied them in silence. Then he looked up at Ser Piero and said something that would change Leonardo's life, bring him to Florence. In 1466, at the age of 14, Leonardo left Vinci for the first time. He traveled with his father down from the hills into the Arno Valley, following the road that led to Florence. For a boy who had spent his entire life in a small town surrounded by countryside, the city must have been overwhelming. Florence was noise and color and movement, narrow streets crowded with people speaking in rapid Tuscan dialect, markets selling everything from silk to spices to books, workshops where hammers rang against metal and the smell of paint and varnish filled the air. And everywhere there was art, sculptures in public squares, frescoes on church walls, painted panels in the homes of wealthy merchants. Even the architecture itself was a form of art. The great dome of the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore dominating the skyline, a feat of engineering that seemed impossible. Ser Piero brought Leonardo to Verrocchio's workshop, located near the church of San Egidio. The workshop was a large space filled with organized chaos. Apprentices of various ages worked at different stations, some grinding pigments, some preparing wooden panels, some sketching from plaster casts of famous sculptures. Tools hung on the walls: chisels, hammers, brushes of every size, compasses, measuring instruments. Half-finished sculptures stood in corners, covered with damp cloth to keep the clay from drying out. Verrocchio himself was in his 30s, a compact, energetic man with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He looked at Leonardo for a long moment, sizing him up. Then he gave him a piece of charcoal and a sheet of paper. "Draw that," he said, pointing to a piece of draped fabric hanging over a wooden frame. It was a test. Drawing fabric was one of the fundamental skills of Renaissance art. The way cloth folded and fell revealed volume, weight, and the structure beneath. Most beginning students struggled with it for months. Leonardo sat down and began to draw. He worked slowly, carefully, his hand moving with quiet confidence. He observed the way light caught the high points of the folds and disappeared into the shadows between them. He noticed how some folds were sharp and angular, while others were soft and rounded. When he finished, he handed the drawing to Verrocchio. Verrocchio studied it without speaking. Then he looked at Leonardo again, with something that might have been surprise, or respect, or perhaps recognition. This boy was different. "You'll start tomorrow," Verrocchio said. And just like that, Leonardo da Vinci's real education began. Life in Verrocchio's workshop followed a strict but rewarding rhythm. Leonardo began as a Garzona studio boister, lowest rank in the workshop hierarchy. His first tasks were mundane: sweeping floors, cleaning brushes, grinding pigments, preparing wooden panels with layers of gesso. It was unglamorous work, but Leonardo approached it with the same intensity he brought to everything. When grinding pigments, he noticed how different minerals produced different colors, how azurite made blue, how malachite made green, how the fineness of the grinding affected the intensity of the color. When preparing panels, he studied how the wood grain affected the surface, how humidity made it expand and contract, how many layers of gesso were needed to create a perfectly smooth painting surface. Nothing was too small to observe, too ordinary to question. The workshop was busy constantly. Verrocchio's reputation meant commissions came from wealthy families, churches, and even the Medici themselves. The studio didn't just produce paintings. They made bronze sculptures, designed architectural ornaments, created elaborate decorations for festivals and weddings, crafted jewelry and ceremonial armor. This breadth of work was unusual. Most workshops specialized, but Verrocchio believed that a true artist needed to master many skills, that sculpture informed painting, that metalwork taught precision, that architecture required understanding of proportion and perspective. Leonardo absorbed all of it. The workshop had other apprentices, young men from good families sent to learn a respectable trade. Some were talented, others merely competent. All of them noticed that the quiet boy from Vinci was different. He didn't socialize much. While the others joked and gossiped during breaks, Leonardo often sat alone, sketching or staring at something with that unsettling intensity. One day, an older apprentice asked him what he was looking at. Leonardo pointed to a rope coiled on the floor. "I'm trying to understand how it holds its shape," he said. "How each loop presses against the next, how the weight distributes, why it coils this way instead of another." The other apprentice laughed and walked away. But Verrocchio, who had overheard, looked at the rope himself, then at Leonardo, and said nothing. He simply nodded. As Leonardo progressed in his training, he was given more complex tasks. He learned to draw from plaster casts, caster copies of famous ancient sculpture, straining his eye to capture three-dimensional forms on flat surfaces. He drew hands endlessly. Hands were difficult. The bones and tendons moved in complex ways, creating subtle changes in shape depending on position and gesture. Leonardo filled pages with hand studies, hands, gripping, pointing, relaxing, clenched in fists, open in blessing. He didn't just draw what he saw. He tried to understand the mechanics beneath the skin. He also began to study perspective, the mathematical system that allowed artists to create the illusion of depth on a flat surface. Brunelleschi had pioneered these techniques decades earlier, and Florentine artists had refined them into a set of rules. Parallel lines converging at a vanishing point, objects appearing smaller in the distance, proportions calculated according to geometric principles. Leonardo mastered the rules quickly, but then he began to question them. The rules worked for architecture, for rooms and buildings with straight edges and right angles. But what about organic forms? What about the curve of a face, the roundness of a shoulder, the way fabric draped over irregular shapes? He started developing his own techniques for creating depth and volume, not just through linear perspective, but through the subtle gradation of light and shadow. He noticed that edges in nature were never truly sharp. There was always a transition zone, a soft blurring where one form met another, where light faded into shadow. He began to use this observation in his drawings, softening edges, creating forms that seemed to emerge from the surface rather than being drawn upon it. Verrocchio noticed this development. One afternoon, he called Leonardo over to look at a painting in progress, a portrait of a young woman. Another apprentice had painted the face, but something was wrong. It looked flat, lifeless, like a mask rather than a person. "What would you do differently?" Verrocchio asked. Leonardo studied the painting in silence. Then he pointed to the transition between the light side of the face and the shadow side. "Here," he said. "The edge is too hard. In life, the shadow doesn't start suddenly. It grows gradually, softly. and the eyes they need to catch the light differently. A tiny highlight, here, to show moisture. Verrocchio handed him a brush. Chamois. Leonardo worked on the portrait for perhaps an hour, making small adjustments. He softened the transitions between light and shadow. He added subtle variations in skin tone, a hint of warmth in the cheeks, a coolness in the shadows under the chin. He placed tiny highlights in the eyes that made them suddenly seem wet, alive, aware. When he stepped back, the face had transformed. It was no longer a competent rendering. It was a person. Verrocchio stood silently for a long moment, studying what Leonardo had done. Then he turned to the other apprentices in the workshop. "Watch this one," he said, gesturing to Leonardo. "He sees what others miss." It was high praise from a man who rarely gave it. But more important than Verrocchio's approval was what Leonardo was learning about himself. He was beginning to understand that his gift wasn't just technical skill, it was observation. The ability to see not just what was there, but what was actually there. Around 1472, when Leonardo was about 20, Verrocchio received a commission for a large altarpiece, the Baptism of Christ, for the church of San Salvi near Florence. It was an important commission, and Verrocchio planned the composition carefully. Christ standing in the Jordan River, John the Baptist pouring water over his head, God's hands reaching from heaven, and two angels kneeling at the left, holding Christ's robes. Verrocchio painted most of the piece himself, using tempera, the traditional medium of mixing pigments with egg yolk. But he gave Leonardo a section to complete, one of the two angels, the one on the far left. It was both a test and an opportunity. Leonardo approached the task with obsessive care. Instead of tempera, he used a newer medium oil paint, which was just beginning to be adopted in Italy from Northern Europe. Oil paint dried more slowly than tempera, which meant it could be blended more smoothly. Colors could be layered to create subtle gradations. The paint itself had a richness, a depth, that tempera couldn't match. Leonardo painted his angel with exquisite delicacy. The face was youthful, almost androgynous, with soft features and a gentle, contemplative expression. The hair fell in curls that seemed to have individual weight and movement. The fabric of the robe wasn't just blue, it was many shades of blue, shifting from light to dark with such subtlety that it seemed to glow. And the angel's gaze, it wasn't looking at Christ being baptized. It was looking slightly away, as if lost in thought, as if aware of something beyond the frame. When Verrocchio saw the completed angel, something changed. The story, perhaps exaggerated but widely told, is that Verrocchio looked at Leonardo's angel, then at his own work on the rest of the painting, and realized his student had surpassed him. According to the tale, Verrocchio put down his brushes and said, "I will never paint again." Whether this actually happened is unclear. Verrocchio did continue to work, though he increasingly focused on sculpture rather than painting. But the story captured something true. Leonardo had reached a level of skill that was exceptional even in a city full of exceptional artists. In 1472, at age 20, Leonardo was admitted to the Painters' Guild of Florence, the Compagnia di San Luca. This was a significant milestone. It meant he was recognized as a master in his own right, free to take commissions and work independently. But Leonardo didn't leave Verrocchio's workshop. Not yet. He stayed for several more years, continuing to learn, to collaborate, to experiment. During these years, he began to pursue an interest that would become lifelong: anatomy. Leonardo wanted to understand how bodies worked, not just on the surface, but beneath the skin. How did muscles attach to bones? How did tendons create movement? What gave a face its unique shape? In Renaissance Florence, Human dissection was technically illegal and religiously problematic. The body was considered sacred, and cutting it open was seen as desecration. But there were ways around these restrictions. Medical schools sometimes obtained bodies for study, usually executed criminals or the unclaimed dead. And artists, particularly those working on religious commissions depicting the crucifixion or martyrdoms, had legitimate reasons to understand human anatomy. Leonardo began attending dissections when he could, watching as physicians and surgeons opened bodies to reveal the structures inside. At first, he simply observed, making mental notes, but soon he started sketching quick drawings of bones, muscles, organs. He noticed things the physicians overlooked: how the muscles of the neck connected to the skull and shoulders in a complex web of tension, how the eye sat in its socket, surrounded by small muscles that controlled its movement, how the hand had so many tiny bones, each one shaped perfectly for its function. These weren't just artistic studies. Leonardo was trying to understand the engineering of the human body, to see it as a machine, beautifully designed, perfectly functional. But Leonardo's curiosity extended beyond anatomy. He studied optics, how light entered the eye, how vision worked, why distant objects appeared smaller. He experimented with perspective, creating mathematical systems for depicting curved surfaces and complex spatial relationships. He filled notebooks with observations and questions, writing in his distinctive mirror, script writing from right to left, with letters reversed, so that the text could only be read easily with a mirror. Some historians think this was to keep his ideas secret. Others suggest it was simply natural for Leonardo, who was left-handed and found this direction more comfortable. Whatever the reason, the notebooks became repositories of everything Leonardo observed, wondered about, or imagined. His mind didn't move in straight lines. A page might start with notes on painting technique, shift to observations about water flow, include a sketch of a bird's wing, and end with a design for a mechanical device. Everything connected in Leonardo's mind. Art informed science. Science informed art. Nature was the ultimate teacher, and everything in nature followed principles that could be understood. By his mid-20s, Leonardo was becoming known in Florence not just as a talented painter, but as someone unusual, brilliant but strange, obsessive, unwilling to accept conventional wisdom about anything. He took commissions slowly, often failing to finish them on schedule or at all. He would get distracted by some technical problem or new area of investigation, leaving paintings incomplete while he pursued other interests. This habit frustrated patrons, but it also made Leonardo's completed works more valuable. When he did finish something, it was extraordinary. By the late 1470s, Leonardo was ready to leave Verrocchio's workshop and establish himself as an independent master. He had surpassed his teacher. He had mastered the techniques of Renaissance art. But he had also begun to develop his own vision, one that went far beyond painting. He didn't just want to depict the world. He wanted to understand it, to decode its secrets, to see the invisible patterns that governed everything from the flight of birds, to the flow of water, to the expressions on a human face. And Florence, for all its glory, was starting to feel too small for the questions Leonardo was asking. Soon, an opportunity would arise to leave too, travel to another city, to serve a different kind of patron, to explore new ideas. But that is a story for another time. By 1482, Leonardo was 30 years old, established as an artist in Florence, yet restless. The city was crowded with talent. Botticelli was painting his ethereal goddesses. Ghirlandaio was creating detailed frescoes for wealthy patrons. Young Michelangelo was beginning to attract attention. Leonardo had commissions, but he also had a problem. He had started two important paintings, Saint Jerome and the Adoration of the Magi, and left both unfinished. Distracted by technical experiments and other interests, Cliffs were growing frustrated. Leonardo's reputation for brilliance was matched by his reputation for unreliability. He needed a change, a place where his unusual combination of interests, art, engineering, anatomy, mathematics would be valued, rather than seen as distraction. And then he heard about an opportunity in Milan. Milan was different from Florence. It wasn't a republic governed by merchants and guilds. It was ruled by a single family, the Sforzas, who had taken power through military force and maintained it through careful political maneuvering. The current ruler was a man named Ludovico Sforza, called Il Moro the Moor, because of his dark complexion and black hair. Ludovico was technically just the regent, ruling on behalf of his young nephew, the official duke. But everyone knew Ludovico held the real power, and he had grand ambitions for Milan. He wanted to make it the most magnificent court in Italy, more splendid than Florence, more cultured than Venice, more powerful than any of the rival city-states that constantly competed for dominance. And he needed talented people to help him achieve this vision. Architects to build monuments, engineers to construct fortifications and canals, artists to decorate his palaces, musicians and poets to entertain his court. When Leonardo learned that Ludovico was looking for skilled engineers, he saw his chance. He sat down and wrote a letter, what might be one of the earliest job application letters in history. It was an extraordinary document, not humble or deferential, but bold, confident, listing his abilities in a numbered format that read like a catalogue of impossibilities. The letter began with military engineering, the skills Ludovico needed most in a time of constant warfare between Italian states. Web and Ciento says, I have plans for very light, strong and easily portable bridges, Leonardo wrote, with which to pursue and, on some occasions, flee the enemy web. 106. He described ways to drain moats during sieges, methods for destroying fortresses, designs for cannons that could fire rapidly and create devastating smoke web. 106. He promised covered vehicles, armored, mobile, able to break through enemy lines while protecting the soldiers inside web. 106. He offered plans for tunneling under fortifications silently, for naval warfare devices, for catapults and siege engines of wonderful efficiency, not in general use. Web. 106. 9 of the 10 points in the letter focused on warfare and engineering. Only at the very end, almost as an afterthought, did Leonardo mention art. In time of peace, I believe I can give as complete satisfaction as any other in the field of architecture. Also, I can execute sculpture in marble, bronze, and clay. Likewise, in painting, I can do everything possible as well as any other, whosoever he may be. Web. 106. It was a brilliant strategy. Leonardo knew what Ludovico wanted to hear. He presented himself, not primarily as a painter. Florence had plenty of those, but as a military engineer and technical innovator. Web. 104. The letter worked. In 1482, Leonardo traveled north from Florence to Milan, leaving behind his unfinished paintings and his complicated relationship with Florentine patrons. Web. 102. He brought with him a silver lyre shaped like a horse's head, a gift for Ludovico, crafted in Florence. Leonardo was known as a skilled musician as well as everything else, and the lyre was meant to demonstrate this talent. When he arrived at the Sforza court, Leonardo found a world very different from Florence's workshops. The court was vast, elaborate, hierarchical. Ludovico lived in the Castello Sforzesco, a massive fortress palace in the heart of Milan, surrounded by walls and moats. Web 106. Inside, the court teemed with activity, nobles and their families, ambassadors from other states, soldiers and military advisors, artists, musicians, poets, scholars all competing for the Duke's attention and patronage. Ludovico himself was intelligent, ruthless, and cultured. He loved magnificence and spectacle, but he also understood power. He collected talented people the way other princes collected jewels. Web 106. And Leonardo, with his extraordinary range of skills, was exactly the kind of acquisition Ludovico prized. The letter began with military engineering, the skills Ludovico needed most in a time of constant warfare between Italian states. Web and 106. I have plans for very light, strong and easily portable bridges, Leonardo wrote, with which to pursue and, on some occasions, flee the enemy. Web 106. He described ways to drain moats during sieges, methods for destroying fortresses, designs for cannons that could fire rapidly and create devastating smoke. Web 106. He promised covered vehicles, armored, mobile, able to break through enemy lines while protecting the soldiers inside. Web 106. He offered plans for tunneling under fortifications silently, for naval warfare devices, for catapults and siege engines of wonderful efficiency, not in general use. Web 106. 9 of the 10 points in the letter focused on warfare and engineering. Only at the very end, almost as an afterthought, did Leonardo mention art. In time of peace, I believe I can give as complete satisfaction as any other in the field of architecture. Also I can execute sculpture in marble, bronze and clay. Likewise in painting, I can do everything possible as well as any other, whosoever he may be. Web 106. It was a brilliant strategy. Leonardo knew what Ludovico wanted to hear. He presented himself, not primarily as a painter. Florence had plenty of those, but as a military engineer and technical innovator. Web 104. The letter worked. In 1482, Leonardo traveled north from Florence to Milan, leaving behind his unfinished paintings and his complicated relationship with Florentine patrons. Web 102. He brought with him a silver lyre shaped like a horse's head, a gift for Ludovico, crafted in Florence. Leonardo was known as a skilled musician as well as everything else, and the lyre was meant to demonstrate this talent. When he arrived at the Sforza court, Leonardo found a world very different from Florence's workshops. The court was vast, elaborate, hierarchical. Ludovico lived in the Castello Sforzesco, a massive fortress palace in the heart of Milan, surrounded by walls and moats. Web 106. Inside, the court teemed with activity, nobles and their families, ambassadors from other states, soldiers and military advisors, artists, musicians, poets, scholars all competing for the Duke's attention and patronage. Ludovico himself was intelligent, ruthless, and cultured. He loved magnificence and spectacle, but he also understood power. He collected talented people the way other princes collected jewels. Web 106. And Leonardo, with his extraordinary range of skills, was exactly the kind of acquisition Ludovico prized. Leonardo was given apartments in the castle and put to work almost immediately, not on paintings, but on engineering projects. Web 105. Milan needed fortifications. The constant threat of war with neighboring states meant defenses had to be constantly updated and improved. Leonardo designed new types of walls angled to deflect cannonballs rather than absorbing their impact directly. He created plans for moats that could be flooded or drained strategically. He sketched portable bridges that armies could carry and deploy quickly during campaigns. He also worked on hydraulic projects. Milan was surrounded by water rivers, canals, irrigation systems that needed constant maintenance and expansion. Web 108. Leonardo studied water with the same intensity he had brought to every other subject. He watched how it moved, how it eroded banks, how it could be redirected and controlled. He designed canal systems to connect Milan with distant lakes and rivers, plans for locks that could raise and lower boats between different water levels, devices for dredging and cleaning waterways. Web 105. Some of these projects were built, others remained on paper, too ambitious, too expensive, or simply ahead of their time. But Leonardo didn't just work on practical engineering. His mind was constantly inventing, imagining devices that had never existed. He designed what might be called an early tanker-covered, armored vehicle, moved by men turning cranks inside, with cannons protruding from the sides. Web 105. Web 108. It was ingenious in theory, though impracticable in reality. The vehicle would have been too heavy to move effectively, and the men inside would have exhausted themselves quickly. But Leonardo wasn't always trying to build these things. Often he was simply exploring possibilities, asking what if humans could fly like birds. He filled pages with designs for flying machines, wings operated by human muscle power, parachutes to allow safe descent, even a kind of helicopter with rotating spiral blades. Web 108. None of them would have worked with the materials and power sources available in the 15th century, but they showed Leonardo thinking in entirely new directions, refusing to accept that certain things were impossible just because they had never been done. What if soldiers could attack from beneath the water? He sketched diving suits, underwater breathing apparatus, even a kind of submarine. Web 105. What if armies could move at night in complete darkness? He invented a kind of early tank with slots for weapons, a mobile fortress. His notebooks from this period are astonishing, page after page of devices, mechanisms, calculations, observations. But Leonardo's most important work in Milan would ultimately be artistic, not military. Around 1489, Ludovico commissioned him to create a massive equestrian statue, bronze horse honoring Ludovico's father, Francesco Sforza. Web 106. It was to be enormous, the largest bronze horse ever cast, rearing up on its hind legs in a dynamic pose that had never been successfully achieved at that scale. Leonardo threw himself into the project with characteristic obsession. He studied horses endlessly, their anatomy, their movement, their proportions. He visited the ducal stables and sketched the finest horses from every angle. He measured them precisely, noting how the bones and muscles created their powerful, graceful forms. He filled pages with calculations about weight distribution, balance, structural integrity. How could a bronze statue weighing tons balance on just 2 legs? How thick would the metal need to be to support itself without collapsing? He created detailed plans for casting such a massive sculpture not in one piece, which would be impossible, but in carefully designed sections that could be assembled. He built a full-scale clay model, over 20 feet tall, which was displayed publicly to great acclaim. People came from across Italy to see it. It seemed miraculous, a horse frozen in motion, so lifelike it seemed about to leap forward. But the bronze casting never happened. The amount of bronze needed was staggering, nearly 70 tons, and as political tensions increased, as war became more imminent, Ludovico needed that bronze for cannons, not monuments. The clay model remained in the castle courtyard, a testament to what might have been. Years later, when French troops invaded Milan, soldiers used it for target practice. It was destroyed completely. Nothing remains except Leonardo's preparatory drawings. But while working on the horse, Leonardo also received another commission, one that would become far more famous. The refectory of the monastery of Santa Maria del Grozzi needed a mural for its north wall. Ludovico, who had chosen the monastery as the eventual burial place for his family, wanted something magnificent. The subject was traditional, the Last Supper, the final meal Jesus shared with his disciples before his crucifixion. Countless artists had painted this scene. It was one of the standard subjects of Christian art. But Leonardo, as always, wanted to do something different. Most Last Supper paintings were static, formal compositions. Jesus and the 12 disciples arranged in a line, halos over their heads, everyone calm and dignified. Leonardo wanted to capture a specific moment, the instant after Jesus says, "One of you will betray me." That moment of shock, confusion, denial. The disciples leaning toward each other, gesturing, demanding to know who Jesus means. The drama, the human emotion, the psychological complexity of that terrible revelation. He began work around 1495, but not in the traditional way. Frescoes were normally painted on wet plaster, which required working quickly before the plaster dried. But Leonardo wanted to work slowly, to revise, to build up colors gradually with the subtle gradations he had mastered. So he experimented with a new technique, painting on dry plaster, with a mixture of tempera and oil, allowing him to work at his own pace. It was a gamble. The technique was untested, potentially unstable, but it gave Leonardo the control he needed to create the effects he envisioned. He worked on the painting for 3 years, though not continuously. Stories circulated about his working method. He would arrive at the monastery early in the morning and paint all day without stopping, forgetting to eat or drink. Other times, he would stand in front of the painting for hours without touching a brush, simply staring, thinking, making tiny changes in his mind before committing them to the wall. Sometimes days would pass without him appearing at all. The prior of the monastery complained to Ludovico that Leonardo was lazy, that the work was taking too long. Leonardo reportedly told Ludovico that genius could not be rushed, that he was still searching for the perfect model for Judas, and that if he couldn't find one, he might use the prior's face. Ludovico, who appreciated Leonardo's wit as much as his talent, laughed and told the prior to leave the artist alone. Slowly, the painting took shape. 13 figures arranged behind a long table, but not in a simple line. They were grouped in clusters of 3, their bodies turning, gesturing, creating a rhythm across the composition. Jesus sat at the center, calm and isolated, a triangular form surrounded by the chaos of his disciples' reactions. Judas was there, 2 not separated from the others, as in traditional depictions, but part of the group, yet somehow distinct, his face in shadow, his hand clutching a bag of coins, and the space itself, the painted room, seeming to extend the actual refectory, with perspective lines converging at Christ's head, drawing the viewer's eye inevitably to the central figure. It was revolutionary, not just a painting, but a drama unfolding in real time, capturing a moment of profound human emotion. When it was finally revealed, people were stunned. This wasn't religious art in the old sense. This was psychology, storytelling, human truth expressed through paint. Leonardo had transformed a traditional subject into something entirely new, and though the experimental technique would begin failing almost immediately, the paint flaking and fading within decades, the composition itself would influence artists for centuries. But even as he worked on this masterpiece, Leonardo's mind was already moving elsewhere, toward new questions, new observations, new impossibilities to explore. By the early 1500s, Leonardo's fascination with anatomy had deepened into something approaching obsession. Understanding the surface of the human body was no longer enough. He wanted to see inside, to understand the machinery that made life possible. He had been making anatomical drawings since his early days in Florence, but those were based partly on observation, partly on speculation, and partly on ancient texts that were often wrong. Web 97. Now, in Milan and later in Florence, Leonardo began to conduct systematic dissections. Getting access to bodies was never easy. The Church officially disapproved of cutting open human corpses, seeing it as desecration of the temple of the soul. But exceptions were made for medical education, and Leonardo, with his connections to physicians and scholars, found opportunity. Hospital morgues sometimes provided bodies of the unclaimed dead people who had died alone, without family to object or claim the remains. Leonardo would work at night, by candlelight, in cold rooms where the bodies wouldn't decay as quickly. The smell must have been terrible, the work delicate and disturbing. But Leonardo approached it with the same focused intensity he brought to everything. He dissected approximately 30 human bodies over his lifetime, and many more. Animals, horses, cows, pigs, bears, to understand the similarities and differences between species. Web 112. One of his most detailed studies came in 1507, when he performed an autopsy on an old man who had died peacefully in a hospital in Florence. Web 99. Leonardo had spoken with the man shortly before his death. The man claimed to be 100 years old and said he felt no pain, just a gradual fading, like falling asleep. When the man died, Leonardo asked permission to examine the body, to understand what had caused this gentle death. He opened the chest and examined the heart and blood vessels with extraordinary care. What he found was remarkable for its time. He discovered that the man's blood vessels had become narrow and hard, restricting blood flow. This was one of the earliest descriptions of arteriosclerosis, though Leonardo didn't use that name. He simply recorded what he saw. Vessels that should have been soft and open had become rigid and constricted, like old leather. He made drawings of astonishing precision: the heart, the blood vessels branching like trees, the valves that controlled blood flow. Leonardo's anatomical drawings are among his greatest achievements, though they wouldn't be widely known until centuries after his death. He drew bones with architectural precision, showing them from multiple angles: front, side, back, like an engineer, documenting a complex machine. Web Serratus Subla. He sectioned skulls to understand how the brain fit inside, where the cavities were, how the teeth rooted in the jaw. Web 97. In 1489, he obtained a human skull and sawed it into sections, studying how the internal structure related to the external form, trying to understand where consciousness lived, where the soul might reside. Web 97. He drew muscles in layers, showing how they overlapped, how they attached to bones, how they worked in opposition, one contracting while another relaxed to create movement. Web 97. He was particularly fascinated by the hand, that instrument of such infinite capability, able to paint, write, grip, gesture, express emotion through the smallest movements. He filled pages with hand studies, drawing tendons like cables, bones like levers, understanding the mechanical genius of the human body. He studied the eye, trying to understand how vision worked, how light entered, how the image formed, why things appeared upside down, but we perceived them right side up. And he drew the fetus in the womb. One of the most famous of all his anatomical studies, a curled human form floating in the protective cavity of the uterus, connected by the umbilical cord web serratus sabella. The accuracy was remarkable, especially considering he was working without any of the tools of modern medicine or microscopes, no chemical preservatives, just his eyes, his hands, and his relentless curiosity. Between 1510 and 1511, Leonardo worked alongside Marcantonio della Torre, a professor of anatomy at the University of Pavia. Web. 97. Together they may have dissected up to 20 bodies, with Leonardo recording everything in detailed drawings that were meant to eventually become a comprehensive treatise on human anatomy. Web. 97. He planned to publish it to share these discoveries with physicians and artists alike. But like so many of Leonardo's projects, it remained unfinished. The drawings scattered in notebooks that wouldn't be properly studied until long after his death. Still, the work itself was revolutionary. Leonardo wasn't just recording what he saw. He was using art to advance science, and science to perfect art. Around 1503, Leonardo returned to Florence after nearly 20 years in Milan. The city had changed during his absence. A new generation of artists had emerged, and the greatest of them was a young sculptor named Michelangelo Buonarroti. Michelangelo was 23 years younger than Leonardo, and his approach to art couldn't have been more different. Where Leonardo was subtle, Michelangelo was dramatic. Where Leonardo used soft shadows and gentle transitions, Michelangelo carved and painted powerful, muscular figures with sharp definition. Leonardo saw the human body as a machine to be understood. Michelangelo saw it as an expression of divine power and human struggle. The two men disliked each other intensely. Web. 114. Leonardo thought Michelangelo's figures were overly muscular, theatrical, lacking subtlety. Web. 114. Michelangelo mocked Leonardo for abandoning his bronze horse project in Milan, suggesting he couldn't finish what he started. Web. 114. The rivalry became public in 1504, when Florence's city council decided to commission both artists to paint massive battle scenes. It was an intentional competition. The two greatest artists of Florence pitted directly against each other in the same room. Leonardo was assigned the Battle of Anghiari, a chaotic cavalry battle. Web. 114. Michelangelo would paint the Battle of Castina soldiers, surprised while bathing. Web. 114. Both artists created detailed preparatory drawings. Leonardo's sketches showed horses and men entangled in violent chaos, faces contorted with rage and effort, a swirling mass of bodies and weapons. But when Leonardo began painting on the wall, he once again experimented with untested techniques. He tried using a mixture of oils on the plastered wall, applying heat to help the paint dry. The technique failed catastrophically. The paint began to run and blur before his eyes. Frustrated, Leonardo abandoned the project. He left Florence again, first for Milan, then for Rome, leaving the unfinished battle scene on the wall. Michelangelo also never completed his battle painting. He was called away to Rome by the Pope for other commissions. Both works are now lost, though copies of the preparatory drawings survive, showing what might have been the greatest artistic showdown in history. Web. 114. But during this same period in Florence, Leonardo created something that would outlast all the rivalries, all the abandoned projects, all the experiments that failed. He painted a portrait of a woman. Her name was Lisa Gradini, She was the wife of a wealthy Florentine silk merchant named Francesco del Giocondo, which is why the painting would sometimes be called La Gioconda, the joyful one, or the wife of Giocondo Webb, 113. But the world would know it simply as the Mona Lisa. Leonardo began the portrait around 1503, and he would work on it, on and off, for the rest of his life. The commission itself was straightforward. A merchant wanted a portrait of his wife, a common enough request. But what Leonardo created was something entirely different from a conventional portrait. He posed her in a way that was unusual for the time. Most portraits showed people in profile or three-quarter view against plain backgrounds or architectural settings. Leonardo placed Lisa facing the viewer more directly, but with her body turned slightly, creating a spiral pose that seemed relaxed and natural. And behind her, instead of a wall or window, he painted a landscape, a strange, dreamlike vista of winding roads, distant bridges, mountains fading into blue haze. The landscape seemed to exist in a different reality from the woman, as if she was sitting at the boundary between the human world and something vaster, more ancient. But it was the face that made the painting extraordinary. Leonardo used every technique he had developed over decades of observation and experimentation. He applied the sfumato method he had perfected, the soft, almost imperceptible gradations from light to shadow, with no hard edges anywhere. Webb, 113. Without lines or borders, in the manner of smoke. He described it Webb, 113. The shadows around her eyes and at the corners of her mouth were so subtle they seemed to shift depending on the angle of viewing, the quality of light. And that created the famous enigmatic expression. Was she smiling? The mouth seemed to suggest that the corners turned up ever so slightly, but the eyes appeared more serious, thoughtful, perhaps even sad. The expression seemed to change depending on where you looked, how you looked, even how you felt when looking at it. It was as if Leonardo had captured not a fixed expression, but something fluid, alive, impossible to pin down. Webb, 116. Leonardo never delivered the painting to Francesco del Giocondo. Instead, he kept it, carrying it with him as he traveled from city to city. He would take it out and work on it, making tiny adjustments, adding layers so thin they were almost invisible, perfecting details that most people would never consciously notice. It became less a portrait of a specific woman and more an expression of everything Leonardo understood about art, light, human psychology, and the mysterious nature of consciousness itself. The painting was small only, about 30 inches tall, painted on a wooden panel using oil paints, but it contained worlds. Every detail had been observed and rendered with obsessive precision. The transparency of the veil over her hair, the delicate folds of her dress, the subtle modeling of her hands, resting one over the other with perfect naturalness, and those eyes which seemed to follow the viewer, a trick of the painting's geometry and the way Leonardo had rendered the gaze. In his later years, Leonardo would tell people that of all his works, this portrait came closest to capturing what he called the motions of the mind, the inner life of a person made visible. He took the painting with him when he left Italy for France in 1516, invited by King Francis I to spend his final years in comfort and honor. After Leonardo's death in 1519, the painting passed to the French royal collection, eventually ending up in the Louvre, where it would become the most famous painting in the world. But during Leonardo's lifetime, few people ever saw it. It was a private achievement, a dialogue between the artist and his own understanding of what painting could be. Not just representation, but revelation. Not just surface, but soul. And as Leonardo grew older, carrying his small portrait from place to place. He must have known he had created something that would outlast not just his own life, but the memory of everyone he had known. Everyone who had praised or criticized him, everyone who had wondered why he couldn't just finish things and move on. He had captured something essential, something that would make people stop and look, centuries later, wondering about the woman's expression, feeling the pull of her gaze, sensing the presence of a mind vast and curious enough to see into the heart of what it means to be human. And that, perhaps, was enough. By 1513, Leonardo was in his early 60s old, by Renaissance standards, when most men didn't live past 50. He had spent time in Rome, working at the Vatican under Pope Leo X, but found the experience frustrating. Rome was dominated by younger artists: Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling, Raphael decorating the papal apartments. Leonardo felt increasingly out of place, respected for his past achievements, but no longer at the center of artistic innovation. And his right hand, the hand that had drawn and painted for 5 decades, was beginning to fail him. Some historians believe he suffered a stroke that left his right side partially paralyzed. Webb, 126. Leonardo was left-handed, so he could still draw and write, but the fine motor control needed for painting was becoming more difficult. He continued to work in his notebooks, but the entries grew more philosophical, more reflective. And then, in 1516, everything changed. King Francis I of France, young, energetic, passionately interested in art and learning, sent Leonardo an invitation. Webb, 120. Come to France, live in comfort, work on whatever interests you. No obligations, no deadlines, just honor and support. The title Francis offered was impressive. First painter, architect, and engineer to the king. Webb, 122. Along with it came a generous annual pension and a beautiful residence, the Château du Clos-Luce, a small manor house built of pink brick and tufa stone in the Loire Valley town of Amboise. Webb, 122. At 64, Leonardo decided to make one final journey. He crossed the Alps and Amulo, same mountains he had crossed as a young man traveling to Milan, now traversing them again in the opposite direction, much older, much slower. With him, he carried 3 paintings: the Mona Lisa, St. John the Baptist, and Virgin and Child, with Santa and Webb, 120. Webb, 123. He also brought his notebooks, thousands of pages filled with drawings, observations, calculations, questions, the accumulated work of a lifetime, the physical record of one of the most curious minds in human history. When Leonardo arrived at Clos-Luce in late Wu Yi, he found a comfortable home connected to the royal chateau of Amboise by an underground passage. King Francis could visit easily, and he did so often, eager to talk with the famous artist about art, science, philosophy, anything. According to Francis himself, no man possessed such a knowledge of painting, sculpture, or architecture as Leonardo. But the same goes for philosophy. He was a great philosopher. Webb, 120. Leonardo's rooms at Clos-Luce were simple but pleasant: windows overlooking gardens, good light for working, space for his few belongings, and many papers. He was accompanied by Francesco Melzi, his devoted student and assistant who had been with him for years, and Salai, another long-time companion. King Francis gave Leonardo complete freedom. No commissions, no pressure, no demands, just the respect due to an old master and the space to spend his final years however he wished. Leonardo continued to draw and to think. He designed plans for a royal palace for Francis, an ambitious project that was never built, but showed Leonardo's imagination still at work. Webb, 123. He sketched ideas for canal systems to connect the major rivers of France, drainage projects, hydraulic machines. He drew apocalyptic visions, massive floods and catastrophes, swirling waters destroying mountains, the end of the world rendered in black chalk with terrifying power. Webb, 123. Were these just imaginative exercises, or reflections of an aging man contemplating mortality and the impermanence of all human achievement? His notebooks from this period show a mind still questioning, still observing, but also beginning to look backward, to reflect on what had been learned and what remained mysterious. He wrote about friction, the resistance objects encounter when moving against each other, and developed principles that would be formalized in physics for another. 200 years, Webb, 127. He sketched designs for mechanical systems, for devices that could amplify force or redirect energy. Webb, 127. But increasingly, his notes took on a different quality, less about specific projects and more about the patterns underlying everything. How water flows in spirals that mirror the curl of hair, the spiral of shells, the rotation of galaxies, how everything in nature follows similar principles at different scales, a kind of unity hidden beneath apparent diversity. Leonardo had spent his life trying to understand the world through observation, through drawing, through taking things apart to see how they worked. Now, in his final years, he seemed to be arriving at something larger, a sense that everything connected, that there was an underlying order, a mathematical beauty to existence itself. But his body was failing. By early 1519, Leonardo knew his time was short. On April 23rd, he summoned a notary and dictated his will. Webb 120, Webb 126. It was a careful, detailed document, revealing both his practical concerns and his deep affections. He left money for masses to be set for his soldiers, despite his reputation for heterodox thinking. He wanted the Church's final blessing. He made provisions for servants who had been with him, ensuring they would be cared for, and most importantly, he bequeathed his notebooks, manuscripts, and drawings to Francesco Melzi, the student who had been like a son to him. Webb 119, Webb 120. To Messer Francesco de Melzi, nobleman of Milan, I leave all, and each of the books at present in my possession, and other instruments and drawings relating to my art and profession as a painter. Webb 124. It was the most valuable bequest Leonardo could make, not gold or property, but knowledge, observation, the accumulated insights of a lifetime spent studying the world. 9 days later, on May 2nd, 1519, Leonardo died in his bed at Clos Luz. Webb 119, Webb 126. He was 67 years old, a full life by Renaissance standards, though not as long as the century-old man whose death he had studied with such care years before. A legend arose later that Leonardo died in the arms of King Francis I, with the young king weeping over the loss of his friend and mentor. Webb 125. It's a beautiful story, the genius recognized and honored at the end, dying in the embrace of royalty, but historians doubt it. Records suggest Francis was elsewhere on the day of Leonardo's death, dealing with affairs of state. Webb 125. Leonardo probably died more quietly in his room, perhaps with Melzi at his bedside, slipping away peacefully like the old man he had once studied. No dramatic final words recorded, no great revelation at the last moment, just the gentle ending of a life that had been lived with extraordinary intensity, curiosity, and creativity. He was buried in the church of St. Florentin in Amboise, with a modest ceremony befitting a respected artist and engineer. The church was later destroyed during the French Revolution, and Leonardo's bones were lost, scattered. Their exact location now unknown, so even his physical remains returned to mystery, leaving behind only the work of paintings, the drawings, the thousands of notebook pages covered in mirror writing and precise sketches. After Leonardo's death, Francesco Melzi carefully guarded the notebooks, understanding their value, even if the world did not yet fully appreciate it. Web 124. Melzi organized some of the material, attempted to prepare sections for publication, and protected the collection for the rest of his life. But when Melzi died in 1570, the notebooks began to scatter. Web 124. His heirs didn't understand what they had. To them, these were just old papers, sketches and scribbles in a backward script that was difficult to read. Some were sold to collectors. Others were given away as curiosities. Some simply disappeared, used as scrap paper or lost to time. Web 124. The notebooks that survived were dispersed across Europe, in Milan, in Paris, in Madrid, in England. The Codex Atlanticus, a 12-volume collection, ended up in the Biblioteca Ambrosiana in Milan. Web 124. The Codex Leicester, later purchased by Bill Gates, passed through various private collections. Web 124. Others remain in the Royal Collection at Windsor Castle, in the Institut de France, in scattered libraries and museums. Web 100. In total, about 7,200 pages of Leonardo's notebooks survive, roughly half of what he probably produced during his lifetime. Web 123. The rest is lost forever. And because the notebooks were scattered, Leonardo's scientific discoveries had little immediate impact. His anatomical drawings, which were more accurate than anything else of the period, weren't widely seen until the 18th century. His observations about friction and mechanics weren't recognized as groundbreaking until the 20th century. Web 127. His designs for flying machines, submarines, and other devices remained unknown to the engineers who would eventually invent similar things centuries later. Leonardo had been working centuries ahead of his time, but his insights were trapped in mirror-written notebooks that only a handful of people ever read. Yet his paintings endured. The Mona Lisa, St. John the Baptist, Virgin and Child with St. Anne, and The Last Supper, damaged though it was, became some of the most famous and influential artworks in Western history. They demonstrated what art could be, not just representation, but investigation, emotion, psychology, the visible expression of invisible thought. Every artist who came after Leonardo stood in his shadow. His techniques of sfumato, his understanding of light and shadow, his ability to capture the motions of the mind, these became the foundations of painting for centuries. Today, more than 500 years after his death, Leonardo da Vinci remains one of the most recognized names in human history. Not just an artist, though his paintings hang in the greatest museums. Not just a scientist, though his anatomical drawings were revolutionary. Not just an engineer, though his designs anticipated technologies that wouldn't exist for centuries. Leonardo was all of these, and something more, a mind that refused to accept boundaries, that saw connections between art and science, between observation and imagination, between what was and what might be. He looked at a bird's wing and saw mathematics. He studied a human face and saw geology. He observed water and saw the same patterns in hair, in air, in the growth of plants. Everything connected for Leonardo. Everything was part of a larger whole, governed by principles that could be understood if you looked carefully enough, questioned deeply enough, refused to accept that things simply were without understanding why. He didn't finish most of his projects. He left paintings incomplete, treatises unwritten, machines unbuilt. But perhaps that's appropriate for a mind that was always moving forward, always finding new questions more interesting than old answers. Leonardo da Vinci showed humanity something important, that curiosity itself has value, that asking why and how is worth doing even if you never reach final answers, that looking closely at the world, really seeing it rather than just glancing, can reveal wonders hidden in the most ordinary things, and that the greatest achievements come not from choosing between art and science, between creativity and analysis, but from embracing both, from understanding that they're not opposites but different aspects of the same human capacity for wonder. Thank you for joining us tonight on this journey through the life of Leonardo da Vinci, from a small hillside town in Tuscany to the courts of Milan and the chateaux of France. From a curious child watching birds to an old man still asking questions about the patterns underlying all of creation. If this story resonated with you, if it helped carry you gently through the night, please take a moment to subscribe to Sleepy History Nights, leave a like, and let us know in the comments which historical figure you'd like to explore next. There are so many lives worth remembering, so many stories that deserve to be told with care and wonder. Until next time, rest well, dream of possibilities, and remember Leonardo's lesson that the world is full of marvels if we be willing to look closely and ask why. Good night, curious minds. Good night, dreamers and observers. Good night, everyone seeking to understand the beautiful complexity of the world around us. Sleep well.